The screams carried through the empty barn for 14 hours and 23 minutes. At least, that's what the old Rutherford County records once noted before they mysteriously vanished from the courthouse in 1923. What took place on that October morning in 1841 would go down as one of the darkest acts of revenge in American history. Though local officials quickly buried the details, claiming the truth was too brutal for the public to know. Ruth Coleman was just 24 when she finally broke. For 7 long years, she suffered the wrath of William Crenshaw, a tobacco farmer, infamous for his cruelty among the enslaved in Rutherford County. What she did to him in those final hours shocked even the seasoned men who discovered the scene days later, and the full truth has remained hidden for more than 180 years. Only recently uncovered letters, medical notes, and court-sealed testimony reveal the unfiltered story of how one woman reached her breaking point and carried out the most calculated vengeance of the antebellum South. In 1841, Rutherford County thrived on tobacco. The rolling hills of western North Carolina were rich with golden leaf, and the crop made landowners wealthy, while enslaved laborers carried the cost. On the surface, it looked like southern gentility, but underneath lay simmering tension. The Crenshaw farm sat 7 miles from the nearest neighbor, isolated and quiet. William Crenshaw inherited it in 1832, along with 12 enslaved people, and a reputation for being a demanding master. Locals used that phrase as a polite mask for something far uglier. By 38, William was a man filled with bitterness. His crops lagged behind his neighbors. His attempts at cotton had failed, and after his wife's death in 1837, he was left alone with nothing but rage and unchecked power. He was a tall, broad man with calloused hands and hard gray eyes that never seemed satisfied. Ruth Coleman was born on the property in 1817, daughter of Sarah Coleman, who worked in the main house. Her childhood was like many others in bondage chores lessons from her mother and the slow realization of her place in a world stacked against her. But everything shifted when she turned 17, just after William's wife died. Ruth was pulled from the fields into the house to take over the duties once managed by the mistress. She was smart, capable, and could read thanks to lessons picked up from the Crenshaw children. She knew numbers, managed supplies, and ran the household with skill. These talents should have earned her some measure of value, but instead they became the very reason William fixated on her. His cruelty began with words. He set standards no one could meet. Ruth polished silver until her hands cracked only to be told it was still dull. She cooked meals as ordered, then endured accusations of ruining the food. His insults grew sharper, tearing into her intelligence, her looks, her worth. The other enslaved workers had strategies to sense and avoid his anger. Moses, the eldest at 52, could almost predict William's moods and guide others away from the house. Ruth, trapped inside by her duties, had no escape. And over those 7 years, the cruelty hardened into something unbearable. That October morning was the moment Ruth snapped. What followed inside that barn was so gruesome, so deliberate, that even hardened men could barely put words to what they found. The county tried to erase it, but the story of Ruth Coleman never fully disappeared. It lingers as a chilling reminder that beneath the surface of Southern order and hospitality, vengeance waited, and sometimes it burned hotter than the tobacco fields themselves. William Crenshaw was careful with his cruelty. He never struck Ruth where anyone might notice. He never touched her hands because he needed them strong enough to keep his house running. Instead, his punishments were calculated kicks to her lower back that left her aching for days, a twisted arm that throbbed when she lifted a pot, sharp slaps to her shoulders that stung without leaving a mark. The physical pain was only part of it. The real torment came from the way he toyed with her hope. He'd tell her she could see her mother, then order her back just as she stepped outside. He'd promise better food, then toss it to his dogs while forcing her to watch. He seemed to study her, learning what crushed her spirit the most and savoring every moment of it. When Ruth's mother Sarah died in the harsh winter of 1840, Ruth lost her last thread of comfort. Alone in the main house, she was left with a man whose cruelty seemed to deepen with every passing month. The others on the farm knew what was happening, but they also knew any attempt to intervene would only tighten Crenshaw's grip on everyone. By the spring of 1841, Ruth was no longer the young woman who once carried a quick smile. She moved with cold precision, her face expressionless, her every motion practiced to avoid setting him off. She learned to read him the way one reads a storm shifts in his voice, the twitch in his jaw, the signs that a blow was coming. She even adjusted her stance so his strikes would land where they would heal fastest. But behind her calm mask, something was building. Ruth was no longer just surviving, she was studying him. She noted that he limped slightly on his left leg when he thought no one was watching. She saw how he avoided fire, flinching near open flames. She recorded every insult, every strike, every broken promise, tucking them away like ammunition for a battle she hadn't yet declared. Hatred had become her only companion, sharp and focused, and it scared even her at times. The breaking point came on October 15th, 1841, a Tuesday that began like any other. Ruth rose before dawn, barefoot and silent, preparing Crenshaw's breakfast just as he demanded. Eggs, bacon, cornbread laid out neatly, strong black coffee poured and waiting. She knew from experience that perfection was no protection. If anything, it made his temper more likely to turn on her. At 6:30 sharp, he walked into the kitchen, boots caked with mud from the drying sheds, his cold eyes scanning the table for a flaw. Finding none, he looked at Ruth instead. "Your hair looks like a bird's nest," he sneered. "Did you even try to make yourself presentable?" Ruth kept her gaze down. Meeting his eyes was dangerous. "Yes, sir. I apologize if it's not to your satisfaction." "It's not," he snapped, dropping heavily into his chair. "A man shouldn't have to look at such slovenliness while he eats. Fix it." She moved quietly to the mirror by the kitchen window, her hand smoothing her hair into place. On the surface, it looked like another morning in Crenshaw's house. But inside Ruth, something final had already shifted. Behind her, Ruth could hear the scrape of Crenshaw's fork against his plate, each bite sharper, louder, more deliberate than usual. Then came his voice, low and accusing. "The eggs are overcooked." Ruth turned startled. She had made them precisely as he always demanded. "Sir, I prepared them the same way as always," she answered cautiously. That was all it took. The plate flew across the room, shattering against the wall just inches from her head. Shards and half-eaten food scattered across the floor, and a fragment grazed her cheek, leaving a thin line of warmth trailing down her skin. His voice dropped into that terrifying, controlled calm. "Are you questioning my judgment? Are you saying I don't know my own preferences?" Ruth dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she gathered the broken pieces. "No, sir. I'm sorry." Her voice was steady, though her body betrayed her fear. He stood above her, boots crunching on ceramic. "Look at this mess. Look what you've made me do. You made me waste good food because you can't follow simple instructions." She knew better than to remind him that it was his hand, not hers, that had hurled the plate. Logic had no place in Crenshaw's world. She tried to work quickly, praying the storm would pass, as it sometimes did. But today was different. He wasn't merely angry. He had decided she was the root of his failures. The bad harvests, the loneliness, the gnawing sense that he would never measure up. They were her fault. At least, That's what he told himself as he looked down at her. "Stand up," he ordered. Ruth rose, broken pieces still cupped in her hands. "Put that down and follow me." The October morning was cold, the grass wet with dew that soaked through the thin fabric of her dress as she trailed him across the yard. His steps led straight to the big barn, the one heavy with the scent of drying tobacco and rusted metal. She had spent countless hours inside, sweeping its floor, moving tools, working during harvest. But this time dread twisted in her stomach as the wooden doors groaned open. Inside, the light was dim strips of sunlight, slicing through gaps in the walls. Crenshaw moved toward the center, where pulleys and ropes dangled from the rafters, used to hoist heavy bales of tobacco. He turned to face her, eyes narrow. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think I don't see the way you look at me, the way you judge me?" Ruth kept her gaze on the dirt floor. There was no safe answer. He circled her slowly, boots crunching with each step. 7 years I've fed you, clothed you, kept a roof over your head. And how do you repay me? With disrespect, with incompetence, with those eyes that say you think you're better than me. He stopped, snatching a length of rope from the pulley system, yanking it hard to test its strength. Ruth's eyes followed the movement, and for the first time that morning, fear sliced through her calm. He spoke almost casually, as though planning chores for the day. "Maybe I should string you up for a few hours. Let you hang here and think about how much you owe me. Think about how grateful you should be." That was it. The words that shattered what was left of Ruth's restraint. 7 years of torment, 7 years of being broken down, told she should be thankful for her suffering. All of it erupted in a single, undeniable flash inside her mind. Something in Ruth Coleman snapped, and there was no turning back. The rage Ruth had smothered for 7 years erupted in a single word. Grateful. It left her lips almost on its own, sharp and dangerous. Crenshaw froze, the rope dangling in his hands. His eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" For the first time in months, Ruth lifted her head and met his gaze. "I said grateful." The silence that followed was electric, the air heavy with sweat dust and the smell of tobacco. Her heart hammered in her chest. They both knew she had just crossed into a place there was no coming back from. Crenshaw's face darkened into something monstrous. He dropped the rope and stepped forward, fists clenched, his voice rising. "You ungrateful." But he didn't finish. Ruth moved with a speed born from survival, sidestepping his lunge and shoving hard against his back. He stumbled into the barn's central beam, his shoulders striking it with a sickening thud. He spun toward her, fury blazing, but she was already moving, her eyes locked on the heavy wooden mallet leaning against the wall. She grabbed it not to swing at him directly, but to bring it crashing down on the pulley rope that held the barn's crossbeam in place. One strike loosened the knot. The second tore it free. Above them, the massive timber shifted, then dropped like thunder. Crenshaw looked up just in time to throw his arms over his head. The beam crashed down at an angle, missing his skull, but slamming across his legs with a horrifying crack. The barn filled with the sounds of splitting wood, snapping bone, and a scream that seemed endless. Dust swirled, rope swung, and then silence except for Crenshaw's ragged animal groans. Pinned beneath the beam, his legs mangled at grotesque angles, he looked up at her with wild gray eyes. "Help me," he whispered. His voice trembled small like a boy's. "Please help me." Ruth stood frozen, the mallet still heavy in her hands. Something shifted deep inside her. In that instant, the entire order of her world flipped. The power was hers. "Help me," he begged again, louder this time, his hands clawing uselessly at the beam. Ruth set the mallet down and stepped closer, her expression eerily calm. You want me to help you? She asked. Yes. Yes, we can. We can work something out. I can change. I swear I can change. She knelt close enough that he could see her face clearly. For the first time in 7 years, he looked at her like she was more than property. For the first time, he realized she held his fate. I don't think I will, Ruth said softly. The hope drained from his eyes, replaced by raw fear. He understood. He was trapped, and the woman he had tormented for years was now the one deciding whether he lived or died. That was when Ruth's true revenge began. What followed was not a frenzy of violence, but something far colder. Ruth had been an unwilling student of William Crenshaw's methods. He had taught her that real cruelty lived in the mind, that the sharpest weapon wasn't the whip or the fist, but the slow drip of despair and the agony of hope withheld. And now, she would return every lesson. My legs, Crenshaw gasped, sweat streaking his face as shock set in. I can't feel my legs. Ruth circled him slowly, her eyes calculating. The beam had shattered his bones, but hadn't severed an artery. He wasn't dying, not yet. He was trapped, broken, but alive. She studied the scene with the same careful precision she had once devoted to laying out his meals just the way he demanded. They're broken, she said flatly. Both of them, multiple fractures. Get help, he rasped. Get Moses. Get the others. They can lift it. Ruth shook her head. Moses is in the far fields. He won't be back until evening. The others are with him. Panic flared in Crenshaw's eyes. Then go. Go get Dr. Harrison. He'll know what to do. Ruth tilted her head, considering. It's nearly 15 miles to town. On foot, that would take me most of the day. Take the horse. Take anything you need. Just go. His voice cracked with desperation. Ruth stopped circling and looked down at him, her face unreadable. You know, in 7 years, you've never once said please to me, unless you were in pain. Her words sank into him like ice. He swallowed, trembling. Ruth, please, whatever you think I've done. She cut him off, her voice still calm but carrying a new, terrifying edge. Whatever I think you've done? She leaned closer. I think you've broken 3 of my ribs. Ruth's voice was steady now, almost measured as she began to recite his sins back to him, like a ledger of debts finally being tallied. I think you've dislocated my shoulder twice. I think you've left me with more bruises than I could count in 7 lifetimes. I think you've called me stupid about 2,000 times. I think you made me crawl on the floor to clean up your messes just because you liked seeing me on my hands and knees. And I think you destroyed food I worked hours to prepare just so I'd know nothing I did was ever good enough. She paused, lifting a crowbar from the workbench, feeling the weight of it in her hands. But mostly she said quietly, I think you made me believe I deserved it. That every blow, every insult was proof I wasn't worth basic human decency. Crenshaw's gray eyes darted between her face and the iron bar she held. I was wrong. He blurted, desperation thick in his voice. I know I was wrong. I can fix it. I can give you freedom, Moneyland, whatever you want. Ruth let out a short, humorless laugh. My freedom? You think that's yours to give? You think freedom belongs to you? She crouched beside him, close enough for him to smell the sweat on her dress. Her voice softened into something almost tender. Let me tell you a story. Master Crenshaw, about a little girl who thought if she was smart enough, good enough, useful enough, maybe the man who owned her would show her kindness. Do you want to hear about her? He gave a weak nod. Ruth's words slipped into a sing-song rhythm. She learned to read. She learned to cook, to clean, to run a household better than most free women. She never complained, never asked for more than the bare minimum. She thought if she proved herself, she might earn mercy. Ruth slid the crowbar under the scattered debris near his leg. But instead of clearing space to relieve him, she shifted pieces of wood and metal so they pressed harder against his shattered limbs. His breath hitched sharply. Ruth's tone never changed. And do you know what happened to that little girl? She learned none of it mattered. She learned her existence alone was enough to deserve punishment. She learned her mind made her dangerous, her skills made her resented, and her hope was something to be stomped out. She adjusted another plank and Crenshaw groaned. So that little girl died? Slowly. Over 7 years. And in her place, someone was born who understands exactly how much pain one person can create for another. Crenshaw was panting now, sweat streaking his face as Ruth stepped back to observe her work. She looked almost clinical, like a craftsman refining a design. The thing is, she said calmly, I learned from the best. I learned that the waiting hurts worse than the blow. That hope is a blade you can twist again and again. And I intend to use every lesson you ever gave me. She set the crowbar aside, walked to the corner, and returned with a small bucket and a ladle. I'm going to get you some water, she said plainly. Because you're going to be here for a while, and I wouldn't want you dying of thirst before we're finished. His cracked voice wavered. Finished with what? She dipped the ladle, held it to his lips, and let him drink deeply. Relief washed over his face, and for a fleeting moment he looked almost grateful. Ruth pulled the ladle away. Her answer was cold and final. Finished with your education. You spent 7 years teaching me what power looks like when one person holds it over another. I was a good student, maybe the best you ever had. Now it's time for your final examination. She placed the bucket just out of his reach, but where he could still see it. Then she carried a stool across the barn, set it 6 feet away, and sat down, her eyes never leaving his face. The sunlight cut through the barn's gaps, illuminating the dust as it drifted around them. William Crenshaw, once the master of the farm and of Ruth's life, lay pinned broken and helpless, staring up at the woman he had underestimated. And Ruth Coleman, calm and deliberate, began the long, terrible lesson he would never forget. Ruth's voice stayed calm, steady, as though she were reciting household accounts rather than shaping the course of a man's fate. I've been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Not this exact one, I never dared imagine you helpless, but I've thought about what I would say if I ever had the chance to speak without fear. Crenshaw tried to shift his broken legs, jerking against the beam. The effort made him groan in pain. Ruth, you have to understand, I never meant. She lifted one finger, a quiet gesture that silenced him more effectively than any shout. It's my turn now. You had 7 years to talk. I had 7 years to listen. Today we're going to reverse those roles. From the pocket of her dress, Ruth pulled out a folded slip of paper. Do you know what this is? He squinted through sweat and shock, shaking his head faintly. Ruth unfolded it with care. The paper was worn covered in neat handwriting. This is a list. I started it 3 years ago when I realized I couldn't rely on memory alone. Every time you hurt me, I wrote it down. Every insult, every blow, every humiliation. She smoothed the page flat and began to read. January 15th, 1839. You twisted my left arm behind my back until my shoulder popped because I dropped a spoon. You called me clumsy and said clumsiness deserved punishment. Crenshaw's face drained of color. Ruth looked up at him, then back at the page. January 22nd, 1839. You kicked me in the back for walking too slowly with firewood. Told me slow workers were thieves stealing time. March 3rd, 1840. You slapped me for crying when I learned my mother was sick, said tears were selfish. Each entry came in the same flat tone, like she was reciting a grocery list. But she watched him as she spoke, measuring every flinch of recognition, every flicker of memory that crossed his face. When she reached August 12th, 1840, her voice slowed. You made me stand in the rain for 2 hours after I asked to see my mother before she died. You said asking for privileges showed ingratitude. Do you remember that one? She folded the paper and slipped it back into her pocket. Her eyes locked on him. She died that night, alone, calling my name. And I wasn't there because you thought I needed to learn my place. Ruth rose and crossed to the wall, selecting a pair of long-handled pliers. She turned them over in her hand, as though considering their balance. That was the night I began the list, because I knew someday, somehow, there would have to be an accounting. Not the kind your courts hand out, not the kind white men give each other when they pretend to care about justice. Real justice. Personal justice. She returned and crouched near him, the pliers dangling from her hand. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to work on getting you free slowly, carefully. And while I do, you're going to apologize for every single entry on this list. Not with empty words, but with truth. You're going to admit what you did and why it was wrong. Hope flickered in Crenshaw's eyes. Yes, I'll apologize. I'm sorry, Ruth, for all of it. Ruth smiled, then a smile colder than her rage had ever been. Oh no, that's not how this works. You taught me that apologies under pressure aren't real. They're just words people say to make the pain stop. Remember when you made me apologize for things I didn't do? You said it wasn't about truth, it was about obedience. She adjusted the pliers and began shifting pieces of debris near his legs. Not freeing him, tightening the trap, adding weight in careful increments that sent his body jolting with fresh pain. No, she said firmly. If you want to apologize, you'll have to earn it. Entry by entry. Every time I read one, you'll feel something equal to what you did. That's only fair, don't you think? His eyes widened as the realization hit him. You can't. Ruth, you can't. This isn't you. Ruth tilted her head almost kindly. You're right, it isn't who I was. But you spent 7 years shaping me into something else. Did you really think I wasn't paying attention? She pressed the pliers against a jagged shard of metal, pushing it deeper into the muscle of his leg. Not enough to cripple him further, but enough to make him scream. Then she sat back down on her stool, unfolded the paper, and cleared her throat. Let's start with entry number 1, she said. January 15th, 1839. The dropped spoon. The torture that followed was clinical and cruel, a lesson in vengeance taught by someone who had been schooled for years in how pain and hope could be used as twin instruments of control. And Ruth conducted it like a teacher grading the final exam. For every item on her ledger, she had invented a matching lesson. So the man who once twisted her arm until her shoulder popped found his own arm trapped beneath splinters and metal at an angle that kept a steady gnawing pressure. And the man who had kicked her for moving too slowly discovered what it meant to be unable to move, while panic and urgency chewed at him from the inside out. The most terrible of her contrivances was water administered with clockwork mercy. Every 30 minutes, cool, clean sips that revived him enough to hope, followed by the calculated withdrawal of relief, so that each renewed cruelty landed harder proof that she understood the arithmetic of anticipation better than any lash could. She read each entry aloud, kept time with a ladle, and judged every apology like a teacher listening for sincerity. Weak apologies meant the lesson would be repeated until the sound of true remorse, if such a thing was possible, echoed back. She discovered a private catalog of his fears and used them, precisely teasing insects across his face to trigger a terror he had always hidden, never allowing actual permanent harm, but engineering a steady state of revulsion and helplessness that clawed at his mind. She reminded him of the night his cruelty had cost her mother, letting the image settle in his chest while she applied pressure. Here shifted debris there, always careful enough to avoid sudden death, but exact enough to ensure increasing desperation. By midday, he was unmade begging, promising anything to make the next cycle end, and Ruth listened with the strange calm of someone reading the facts of a long, slow ledger and then acting on them. When he begged, she pointed out that he sounded like the former. Ruth begging him for mercy, and she quoted back his own lessons about dignity and gratitude before delivering them back to him with surgical patience. She smoothed her dress between motions as if she were simply tidying the house, and then returned to the stool 6 feet away to continue administering lessons until the account was balanced and the man who had taught her cruelty finally learned what it felt like to wait to hope, and to have that hope turned into another instrument of torment. Be grateful for the lessons you're learning. Ruth repeated, her tone as even and detached as if she were reminding him of household chores. Begging is undignified. The sun was sinking lower, its rays slicing through the barn walls at sharper angles, stretching shadows across the dirt floor like long black fingers. By now, Ruth had been at her grim work for more than 8 hours, yet her movements carried no trace of fatigue. If anything, she seemed to draw strength from it. Every apology wrung from him, every fresh cry of pain seemed to feed something inside her that had been starved for 7 long years. "We're making good progress," she remarked matter-of-factly, glancing down at the folded list in her lap. "Only 43 entries left. We should be finished well before midnight." Her calm words fell like hammer blows. Crenshaw no longer responded with coherence. His body slipped in and out of shock consciousness, flickering like a dying candle. But Ruth had studied survival under his hand. She recognized the signs. Each time he started to drift away, she jolted him back, sometimes with pressure on a wound, sometimes with a spider guided across his face, always just enough to force his eyes open again. "Stay with me," she'd whisper, the same tone she once used when tending him through fevers or headaches. "We are not finished yet. You can't leave until your education is complete." Yet as she worked, something inside Ruth was shifting too. She found herself watching him with a detached curiosity, noting how different torments layered upon one another, which combinations of pain and fear produced the most interesting results. She was no longer only punishing, she was observing learning testing. During one of the ritual water breaks, she let him sip deeply before pulling the ladle away. "You know," she said softly, kneeling beside his head, "I never understood why you seemed to enjoy hurting me so much. I thought it was anger or frustration or sickness. But it's not, is it? It's about control. It's about watching someone realize that their entire existence depends on your whim. It's about knowing they can beg, scream, promise anything, and none of it matters unless you decide it does." Her eyes had taken on a strange, distant look, as if she were uncovering truths about herself in real time. "I think I understand now why you kept me close," she continued. "You could have killed me or sold me or worked me to death like the others. But you didn't. Because I was the perfect victim, smart enough to know exactly what you were doing, strong enough to endure it, but powerless to stop it." She gave a small laugh, then low, brittle, and entirely without warmth. "The thing is, Master Crenshaw, you created something you never intended. You turned a frightened girl into someone who knows cruelty better than you ever did. You gave me lessons about power and pain and human nature that I never wanted. But I learned them well." She walked to the barn door and pushed it open slightly. Outside, the fields glowed gold in the late daylight. The workers were still bent over their rows, their labor uninterrupted, their voices faint in the distance. Ruth knew what their return would look like, Moses leading them back at dusk, expecting to see Crenshaw in his chair, and Ruth in the kitchen with supper ready. "They won't come looking for you," she said, turning back toward the broken figure beneath the beam. "Moses knows better than to interrupt when you're disciplining me. They all learned long ago to scatter when they hear screaming from the barn. They won't interfere. Not tonight." The truth of it struck Crenshaw harder than the beam. His cruelty had not only broken Ruth, it had isolated him completely. So Ruth said, settling herself back onto the stool, list in hand, "We have all the time we need. No interruptions, no rescue. No one will know until I decide it's time for you to be found." She smoothed the paper, scanned the next line, and nodded. "Now, where were we? Yes. August 30th, 1840. Those letters were everything she had kept of herself, the only place she could speak honestly, and he had made her watch them burn. She had hidden them under a loose board and thought they were safe until one of his searches found them. And when he discovered the pages, he did not punish her for rebellion or planning. He punished her for being human, for having a private life he could not control. So on an August morning in 1840, he forced her to build a fire and fed her words to the flames while he read them back in a mocking voice, turning her memories of childhood songs and her dying mother into a public joke until every scrap curled to ash. He told her she had forgotten her place and that feelings and private thoughts were luxuries for people like her, and that cruelty was the reminder she needed. But Ruth had never stopped writing. She had only learned to hide better. And now she reached into her pocket and produced a neat bundle of notes, written in the same careful hand she used for her ledger letters, addressed to William Crenshaw, that had accumulated over 3 years as her anger had hardened into purpose. And she read aloud one dated last week in a voice that was almost conversational, telling him she had imagined him helpless beneath a beam begging for mercy, and pictured the look on his face when he understood that his life would hang on her decision. And as she let those sentences hang in the barn, his face went white with a horror that was not just pain, but recognition, because everything she had been through had been catalogued and considered. And the woman who had kept her thoughts secret had used them to plan the reckoning he would finally have to answer. "I imagined taking my time with it," she said, her voice even and quiet, folding the letter and slipping it back into her pocket as if it were nothing more than a household note. But the words had weight. "I pictured you helpless beneath a beam, begging for mercy while I decided whether to grant it, and that fantasy had once been a way to survive nothing more until the day it became real." Ruth picked up the crowbar with steady hands and began the final terrible phase of her plan, moving bits of wood and metal in ways that seemed to free him for a heartbeat, and then redirected the pressures so that relief became a lie and hope a new instrument of pain. "You taught me that hope was the cruelest torture," she reminded him as she worked. And with every careful shift, Crenshaw felt a momentary lift followed by a fresh, sharper agony. A rhythm she had learned by living through his merciless games. The barn smelled of dust and sweat and sun, and as afternoon slid toward evening, Ruth moved with a grim efficiency, her motions precise enough to seem almost professional because cruelty had been her school, and she had become an expert student. She admitted almost to herself that the reality of this reckoning was more satisfying than the daydreams had been, that the power to decide another person's fate carried an intoxicating clarity she had never known before. When she spoke, it was to explain the method, not to plead or boast. You set the rules he had taught her. You showed me how to break a person by dangling kindness and then snatching it away. So now I will return the lesson in full measure. By sunset, she had driven him through dozens of apologies, each one wrung from him with the same predictable responses she had come to expect. And with each admission, his voice grew thinner, his promises more frantic, until he resembled not a man, but a raw animal, driven by one single instinct to stop the pain. "This is not justice," he whispered at one point. Lips cracked and bleeding, and she answered with a quiet, precise correction. Justice would have been a trial, a verdict, a quick end. "This is education," she said, and she would teach him what it feels like to be utterly powerless. "I'm showing you what 7 years of cruelty does to a soul," Ruth said evenly, her words carrying the same gravity as scripture. "I'm giving you the same lesson you gave me, the one about what happens when someone forgets their place in the world." She drew the crumpled, sweat-stained list from her pocket, the paper that had guided every step of her revenge, and smoothed it on her lap. "One last entry," she announced. With neat, deliberate strokes, she wrote October 15th, 1841. William Crenshaw learned what it means to be at the mercy of someone who has no mercy left to give. She folded the paper, carefully tucked it away, and said simply, "Now, we're finished." The final hour of William Crenshaw's life would never appear in any official record, though. Scraps of testimony whispered years later told of Ruth Coleman sitting in the fading light, not torturing, but speaking. She told him about the girl she had once been, about the songs her mother used to sing, the dreams she had held, the fragile hope she had carried. She told him about the moment she realized her humanity meant nothing to him, that in his eyes, she would never be more than property to use, punish, or discard. And she told him how that realization hollowed her out, leaving space for something far darker to grow. "You created me," she said, as his breaths grew shallow. "The woman who could do this. You should be proud. It's probably the most successful project you ever completed." As the barn darkened, Ruth made her final adjustments, shifting the debris so the weight that had tormented his legs now pressed fully against his chest and abdomen. His gasps grew faint, his eyes glazing. "I want you to know that I forgive you," she whispered, kneeling close so he could hear. "Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred has been exhausting, and I'm ready to set it down." At around 9:30 that evening, William Crenshaw's life ended beneath the beam. When Moses and the others returned from the fields, Ruth met them at the barn door, her face serene, her hands folded. "There's been an accident," she said calmly. "Master Crenshaw was working when a beam fell. I tried, but I couldn't move it alone." Moses, who had survived 3 decades by knowing when not to question, simply nodded and organized the men to clear the wreckage. They worked in silence, and when the body was revealed, no one spoke of how recently death seemed to have come. Though Ruth had claimed it had happened that morning, the investigation that followed was perfunctory. A white man had died on his own land. A slave had witnessed it. The evidence fit the story. No one dug deeper. 3 days later, William Crenshaw was laid in the family cemetery, with Ruth among the mourners, standing quietly at the graveside. 6 weeks later, the farm was sold at auction, and Ruth, along with the others, passed into the hands of Thomas Garrett, a neighbor whose reputation for fairness had brought him unusual prosperity in a county where cruelty was the norm. Under Garrett, Ruth slipped back into her role as a domestic worker, efficient and steady, as though nothing extraordinary had happened in the barn that October night. Those who lived alongside her in the years that followed noticed subtle but undeniable changes. Ruth smiled more easily than she had in years, spoke with a quiet confidence that no one dared challenge, and carried herself with a dignity that seemed carved from stone. She never once mentioned the events of October 15th, 1841, and no one ever asked her directly. The barn became another secret in a county full of secrets, and life rolled forward as though nothing had happened. The truth stayed buried until 1923, when workers renovating the Rutherford County Courthouse uncovered a bundle of papers sealed behind a false wall in the basement. Among them was a handwritten confession in Ruth Coleman's precise script, along with a full list of grievances she had kept for 7 years. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a record clinical detailed and utterly devoid of remorse. In its final paragraph, Ruth wrote what legal scholars would later call one of the most chilling statements in American legal history. I write this account not as a confession of guilt, but as a record of justice finally served. William Crenshaw spent 7 years teaching me that some people are born to suffer, while others are born to inflict suffering. Today I proved him wrong. Today I showed him the roles can be reversed, that the teacher can become the student, that the master can become the slave. I regret nothing that happened in that barn, because for the first time in 7 years, the world was exactly as fair as it should be. The documents were quickly resealed, considered too dangerous for public release, and locked away again. 40 years later, in 1963, a fire swept through the courthouse basement, destroying Ruth's confession forever. But the story survived, kept alive in whispers and family legends, in the hushed retellings of those who had always known there was more to that October night. In some versions, Ruth was remembered as a folk hero, a symbol of defiance against a brutal system. In others, she became a warning about the way cruelty corrodes the human spirit until the victim mirrors the oppressor. Yet across every telling, one truth remained. Ruth Coleman had understood something fundamental that day. Some lessons can only be taught through experience, and sometimes the only way for a teacher to truly understand is to become the student. Ruth lived another 37 years, passing away peacefully in 1878 at the age of 61. She never married, never had children, and never spoke publicly about Crenshaw's death. But those who knew her in her final years described her as a woman at peace, someone who had settled her accounts with the world and carried no unfinished burdens. Her gravestone in the Garrett family cemetery bears only her name and dates. Yet legend persists that on certain October mornings, when the mist hangs low and the light strikes just right, faint words can be seen carved into the stone. She remembered everything, and she settled every debt. Whether that inscription ever truly existed remains a matter of debate among historians and folklore enthusiasts. What is certain is that Ruth Coleman's story stands as one of the most unsettling examples of how relentless cruelty can shape a human soul into something its oppressor never intended. Her life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was she justified in what she did, or did she become the very thing she hated? Was this justice or vengeance? What do you think? Was Ruth right to take the power back in the only way she could? Or did she cross a line no one should cross? Share your thoughts below. And let's talk about the dark places history often hides. And if you want more stories like this, tales that pull back the curtain on the forgotten, the forbidden, and the unsettling truths of our past, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who isn't afraid to face history's hardest questions.